For those of you who don't know me, I'm in the Lark department, but I also teach school law. Today I'm here to introduce Professor William Ayers, our distinguished speaker today. He is a distinguished professor of education and curriculum and instruction and senior university scholar at University of Illinois at Chicago. He's a longtime advocate for reform in education. And we can all look forward to reading his article entitled Teaching for Democracy that will be published this fall in DePaul's Journal for Social Justice. So please, warm welcome for Professor Bill Ayers.
Thank you. I was just warned that the food is late and that it's going to come in and then everybody's going to stampede to the food. Is that what is going to happen? Something like that. It's going to be set up in the back. So what I think I'll do instead of, I'll pause if you want when the food comes in, or maybe better, I'll power on for maybe just 10 or 15 minutes to get us started. And then what I'd really like to do is have a conversation. Even though the room isn't set up for conversation, it's still, I think it'll be pretty easy to have some back and forth. So please, originally people had thought maybe you'd write questions on a card, but I just soon take questions fired away. So why don't I speak for a few minutes about the topic, democracy and education, and then open it up, and as soon as I'm through with the initial part, we'll stop and get food. Does that sound okay? Are you starving? Did you come for the food? I know you did. That's why I would go. Anyway, so let me just set this conversation up a little bit. Education and democracy, or teaching for democracies. I am an old teacher and have taught really every level from preschool up through graduate school, with a long stint in the juvenile justice system and some other, odd and outlying educational projects. So I have thought most of my adult life about teaching and the meaning of education. And I have been particularly interested in the last little while about the way in which education gets framed and therefore limits our ability to have a really robust conversation about it. I think you know what I mean when I say framing limits our ability to talk. You understand that kind of it from a lot of different angles, right? So as soon as, for example, one of the interesting debates going on right now is something I've talked about for 8 years, which is this question of the war on terror. Have you heard the debate going on about, because the Obama administration doesn't call it the war on terror. They call it, I can't remember what euphemism they use, but it's kind of funny. But you remember after 9/11, there was a great and open discussion about what had happened and what it meant. And the debate was between the kind of language of the war on terror and, for many of us, the language of criminal justice, the language of a crime has been committed, a criminal justice response is necessary, and that criminal justice response might even involve calling out the armed forces. But it's criminal justice, it's not war. The metaphor matters because once it's a war, all kinds of other things follow. And since I think that narrative is dishonest and have thought that from the beginning, it means when the candidates, for example, are asked, how will you conduct the war on terror? They've already entered into a narrowed or dishonest frame in which to have their discussion. Now, we could argue about whether it's dishonest, but in any case, you see that they've entered a frame, and we're no longer talking about criminal justice, we're talking about war. Well, the same is true in a related way. During the campaign, when candidate after candidate would stand up and say, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom. You remember this? It came from several places, but in the last lap of the campaign from John McCain, he said repeatedly, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom. As soon as he framed his remarks that way, didn't you feel yourself nodding dully? I mean, who's going to object? What am I going to do, stand up and say, the incompetents must stay. I insist. My granddaughters must have the lazy teachers. What the hell? Nobody's going to say that. He won the argument by saying it in a way that framed the limits of the discussion. And since we all kind of are breathing the same air and drinking the same Kool-Aid or tea or whatever, we kind of nod. But if I got to the podium first and I said, every public school kid in America deserves an intellectually curious, morally grounded, compassionate, decent, caring, thoughtful, well-paid, well-rested teacher, we'd agree to that too. So the question is, who gets to frame the issue? And in my view, today, we are suffering in the national political world, in the world of political discourse and debate, in the world of educational discourse and debate, we're suffering from a narrative that is not helpful if we're thinking about where are we headed in this democracy in terms of education. So, what is the narrative? The dominant narrative is that education is a product, much like a stove or a refrigerator or a box of bolts, something you buy and sell. Education is a business. And the way you know it's a business is because all the metaphors are business metaphors. Production and accountability and all these things, while they may make sense in some contexts, in the context of education equals a product, I think they narrow our sights. The clearest expression of this dominant discourse or of this metaphor was the Time magazine cover the week after the election in early December, or no, a month after the election, in early December. You might remember it. It had Michelle Rhee on the cover, R-H-E-E. Do you know Michelle Rhee? She's the superintendent. Oh, I'm sorry. She's the CEO of the Washington Public Schools. We don't have superintendents anymore. Remember, it's a business, and you wouldn't want to have a superintendent of a business. You have a chief executive officer. So Michelle Rhee is the CEO of the Washington Public Schools. She was on the cover of Time magazine, and she was dressed in it. If you don't know her, she's a striking-looking, tall, Korean-American woman with a power business suit and a slash of red lipstick and a broom in front of her. And the title, the cover story is called How to Fix America's Schools. And the pivotal paragraph in the story says this: Michelle Rhee has done more to reform Washington schools in a year and a half than most reformers have done in a decade or more. She's closed 120 schools, she's fired 150 teachers, she's fired 39 principals, and downsized the office staff by a quarter, period. That's what reform means. There's not a word about bringing resources into this starving system. There's not a word about the relevance of curriculum and teaching. There's not a word about supporting teachers. There's not a word about connecting parents and communities to the schools. Because we all agree that the metaphor is business, we can read a paragraph like that and just let it wash over us without challenging it. So the question that I raise in this journal article is, what does education look like ideally in a democracy, at least theoretically? And how would you strive towards that? So one of the things I often think about is that, of course, schools serve social systems. That's true. But if you take, in other words, an agrarian society would have a school system that would train you to farm, right? And an industrial society to participate in industry, and a post-industrial society, and so on. That's pretty straightforward and obvious. But if you think about schools historically and today, let's just take a few quick examples. Let's take fascist Italy and Soviet Albania and medieval Saudi Arabia and apartheid South Africa and the United States. We all agree that kids should stay away from drugs, show up on time, learn the subject matters, do their work, stay away from crime, etc. We all agree with that. So what makes a democracy distinct from an authoritarian regime or some other kind of repressive regime? After all, Soviet schools and German schools produced some very bright, scientists, athletes, artists, scholars, but they also produced a citizenry that was willing, at least for some period of time, to put up with people being marched into the gulag or into the ovens, right? So what makes us distinct, or what theoretically makes a democracy distinct? And I believe what makes it distinct is holding to a value that we take to be central and precious, and that is that each human being is of incalculable and immeasurable value, that every human being is not just equal before the law, which is true, but is worthy of our recognition, our respect, and in some ways our awe and amazement at what we all are or what we all can become. So in a democracy, we take as a principle the immeasurable value of every human being. That has huge implications for policy, huge. And I'm not going to dwell on that, but it has huge implications for policy. Because in a democracy, you would find it offensive to have one school system that spends $30,000 or $40,000 per kid per year in order to go to school, and just down the road, another school spends $4,000 per kid per year to go to school. That's offensive to the notion that we're equal before the law, because what it reminds us of is that if that's the case, and if we defend that, then we believe that child policy basically boils down to something very simple. And frankly, I think this has been child policy for a long, long time, and viciously for the last several years. Child policy boils down to this: pick the right parents. If you pick the right parents, you'll be golden. Everything will work out. You'll go to law school. I mean, who the hell knows what you can do if you pick the right parents. But if you pick the wrong parents, and they live in the wrong neighborhood, and they have the wrong influences and the wrong schools, and no access to libraries or transportation or jobs or a lot of other things, but lots of access to drugs and guns and crime and other things, well, I'm sorry, but you did it. I mean, why'd you end up there? Why couldn't you be more like me? Well, that's foolish, of course, and it's silly, and it's offensive, in my mind, to the very core principle of a democracy. So, in a democracy, if we say, which I think we should say, that the full development of all of us is the condition for the fullest development of any of us, that's just, to me, that's just self-evident as a philosophical principle of democracy. Martin Luther King said it often. You know, I can't be all I need to be unless all of us are what we need to be. And that's a fundamental idea, the idea that the full development of all is the condition for the full development of each, and the full development of each is the necessary condition for the full development of the polity in general. So I take that to be something we should be aspiring to, working toward. The implication for policy is clear. Let me just make one other point before we rush the food, Len. And that is that there are implications in this for curriculum and teaching as well. And these are less explored and less understood and less vitalized in the public discourse. But the implications for curriculum teaching come down to this. In any authoritarian regime, any repressive regime throughout history, the lesson of school and the lesson of society, the curriculum of the larger society is be obedient and conform. Keep your head down and do what you're told. Follow orders and don't make a mess. It's kind of shocking, I think, today, and I would think it would be shocking for you as lawyers to watch the torture memos come out and to remember what the Eichmann prosecution was about, what the Nuremberg prosecutions were about, and to remember, too, that the United States, the Western powers, did hang lawyers in Germany, and they were the lawyers who created the framework for the Holocaust. I don't want to be threatening at all, but you get my point, that we are responsible. And so the idea that we would create a school system or a set of schools that would see obedience and conformity as the hidden curriculum, the null curriculum, that whatever else you're learning to be obedient, to stand in line, to take what you're given, to not make waves, to not resist, to not question, that's an anathema to schooling in a democracy. And so our hidden curriculum in a democracy, theoretically at least, has to be that we want to treat, whatever else we're teaching, we want to teach for initiative, courage, imagination, entrepreneurialness, creativity, all the kinds of things that stand in opposition to a mindless kind of obedience. That means we think of ways, and this is something we can talk about after lunch, we think of ways to create a curriculum of questioning, a curriculum of doing and making, not just receiving and taking in, a curriculum of wondering and imagining. I mean, there are ways to do this, and we see lots of examples around us here in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And it's those things that have to be foregrounded, not the reduction of school to a simple response, not the reduction really of intelligence to a response on a simple bubble test, or the record of your school life to be summed up in a simple test score or a simple metric that doesn't really explain anything about what's happening. Now, we've all endured No Child Left Behind for quite a while, and we know what the result of No Child Left Behind, and the net result is that the kids that it's putatively supposed to help, kids who are near the bottom or kids who are struggling, are actually, in the last 8 years, much further hurt. And as the conservative critics Diane Ravitch and Chester Finn wrote in the New York Times a month ago, the fact is that the last schools in America where you'll have the arts, where you'll have sports, where you'll have clubs, are private schools and privileged suburban schools. Those things are going to be gone for the rest of us. And that is a tragedy in the making that has to be corrected, and it has to be upended. So it's challenging those things that, that is really kind of what the work is about. I'm going to say one last word on, I'm mindful of your starvingness, so I'm going to say one last word on the question of what I mean in the world of curriculum and teaching, and we can expand on this a lot in a few minutes. But what I mean by that is, I could give you two quick examples, one kind of profound and historical and one kind of silly and contemporary. The profound historical example is this. During the Civil Rights Movement, which now has become kind of a narrative has been written, it's kind of been summed up, and it's, believe me, for those of you young, it's mostly a myth. You know, Martin Luther King was a dreamer who led a bus boycott, made a speech, won a Nobel, and then went to sleep. Nothing like that happened. Nothing like that happened. But that's kind of the narrative. We used to be bad, now we're good. But during the Civil Rights Movement, when everything was in question, and you may not know this parenthetically, but when Martin Luther King died, his popularity was lower than George Bush's when he left office. Think about that. I don't mean Bush is coming back, don't get me wrong, but I think it's interesting to note that popularity is a weird metric in itself. But in any case, the Civil Rights Movement was ebbing and flowing and struggling, and nobody knew what the outcomes would be, and nobody knew where it was going. And in 1963, a young volunteer named Charlie Cobb, who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and was a student at Morehouse, Cobb wrote a proposal to create freedom schools all over the South as a way to re-energize the flagging civil rights movement. And in those days, a proposal didn't mean something to the MacArthur Foundation or the U.S. Department of Education or Department of Justice. It was written on a page about this big, and it was mimeoed off and given to his friends. And in the memo, in the proposal, Charlie said, "The black people of Mississippi have been denied many things: forward-looking curriculum, fully trained teachers, decent facilities. But the fundamental injury is that they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how their lives might be different. That denial is fundamental to the denial of democracy. If you can't think about how you got here and where you might go and how it might be different, you can't locate yourself in history. You can't think of yourself as a work in progress, but only as a cog in somebody else's machine, then you're denied the basic democratic right of, participation, invention, engagement, and all the rest." So Charlie called for the creation of freedom schools, which were, over the next year, created all over the South. And the curriculum of the freedom schools, which I was very, very happily involved in then, was a curriculum, 25-page curriculum of questioning. It was all questions. It begins this way: why are you and I in the freedom movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What do we want to change? What do we want to keep the same? That's the opening line of the freedom school curriculum. Pretty profound if you think about it. And think about it for black kids in Mississippi in 1964. You may know that 3 of the martyrs of Mississippi, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, that 2 of them were freedom school teachers, and that all 3 of them had been investigating the arson of a freedom school when they were kidnapped and lynched. So don't doubt the power of saying in the medieval slaveocracy of Mississippi in those days, don't underestimate the power of just asking those questions. They were huge. But I have contended from then until now that a curriculum of questioning is one part of what makes a school a living embodiment of democracy. So I'll give you my trivial, silly example because I thought it up and therefore I think it's brilliant. You know who Governor Huckabee is, right? You may not know, you know him as a presidential candidate. You may not know that he was the poster person for dramatic weight loss. He was huge in Arkansas, and he lost something like 180 pounds or something. And he has become a spokesperson against childhood obesity and a lot of other good causes. And so, God bless him for that. But the state of Arkansas, in its wisdom, because it got the religion around obesity, they decided that what they ought to do is they ought to give every kid in an Arkansas public school on their report card their body mass index. Remember reading this? Yeah, to some of you it's shocking. It's shocking to me. But you just think about taking home a report card. English A, mathematics C, and I'm fat. Wow, damn, what am I going to do with this? And why am I taking this home? Anyway, they know I'm fat. It's crazy. Anyway, you think about, wow, what are people thinking? So I immediately thought, with a class I was teaching at the time, I thought, how would we create a curriculum of questioning? We don't just receive the wisdom from the Department of Education and then, salute and march in lockstep. What if they asked us to give them the names of the Jews in class? We wouldn't do that. So why are we doing this? It's not equivalent, don't get me wrong. But you see what I'm saying, that we don't mindlessly just salute when the Department of Education asks us to do something, right? So I would like to think that if I were in Arkansas, I might not resist. I might not say I can't do that on principle. I don't know what my principle would be, but I might say with a group of kids, let's question this. Let's wonder about this. And I might generate questions like we did with the Freedom School curriculum. I might say, what's the history of these kinds of reforms changing behavior? Alcohol prevention, pregnancy prevention, etc. What's the history of this kind of top-down reform in terms of changing behavior? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be interesting for a group of high school kids to ask that question. What's the condition of sports teams in the Arkansas public schools? How about intramural sports? How about the condition of our parks? Are our parks places where people exercise? Who has the franchise on the lunchroom and the snack bar? And what are they serving? And how do we know it's good for us? And I'm just beginning. You see where we could go with this in the interest of contextualizing, historicizing, politicizing, but mainly in the interest of thinking with your brain and having a question and not just accepting the world as it's given to you, but always wondering, what else? What next? What could we do? So this, to me, is something that we should fight for and fight to change the metaphor from a metaphor of schooling is business, education is a product, to the metaphor of schooling in a democracy is all about about recognition of people as works in progress, living in history, and on a journey, which is their fundamental right to think about the world and to think about how things might be otherwise. So let's take a break. Thank you very much. That's great. Super. Okay. In my role as the authoritarian lecturer with the mic, notice I'm the one with the mic. That's how you know. In any case, what I thought we would do while you're eating and getting lunch is that I would take, maybe 5 or 6 questions and then kind of sort through them and then take 5 or 6 more questions. And the reason for that is that it's often the case in a Q&A like this with one person at the podium that the person who's kind of most used to speaking up, or the men or the older men, you know what I mean? Don't let that happen. So I don't want to just kind of let this go in only one direction. So if I take 5 or 6 questions, maybe then we can get a real conversation going. So maybe I should ask first, is anybody shy? Anybody in the room shy? Because I was going to call on you first if you're shy. Okay, if nobody's shy, then I expect a lot of questions, and you can keep munching. So fire away, 5 questions, and then I'll talk a little bit more while you eat. Yes, sir? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Paul Temple. I'm a member of the Journal for Social Justice.
And what year?
I'm in third year.
My sympathies. So you're going on the job market.
I would say I'm going on the job searching market.
Yeah, that's where you'll stay. No, good luck. Good luck, good luck, good luck. Good luck.
My question to you is, you talked a lot about democracy in the classroom and how we should change the classroom. You mentioned No Child Left Behind. Are there specific policy proposals currently before Congress or that our president is considering that you support? And what can we do to help support those proposals in Congress?
Sure. Yes.
Shay Laughlin at the Center for Public Interest Law. I'd like to hear what you think about Arnie Duncan and where his leadership will take us.
Okay. Arnie Duncan. So one question about policy, No Child Left Behind, but also current policies that might be more hopeful than that are currently being debated and discussed. And then Arnie Duncan, yes.
If you brought the curriculum of questions, if you brought that into juvenile hall when you taught there, what are some of the answers from students that you think of often?
Okay. I taught for a while in the Audie home, and so she's asking about, how we did curriculum of questioning there. Others, yes, ma'am. Introduce yourself. Sorry. That sinking boat. Yes, go ahead. We're just kidding. We won't kid about that anymore.
And that plan, which I believe is somewhat related to Arnie Duncan, is kind of the same model that they're planning on bringing to the national level. What are some of the challenges of that plan, specifically the privatization of public education?
Okay, one more. Be brave. Yes, ma'am.
Allison Relieve, I'm a LARC professor. I teach the public interest sections. Who here? Great. What do you think the position or what is the place of private education, going off of what Ms. Van Poon said, the place of private education and even homeschooling for a democratic educational system? Do they have a place and what place should that be?
Cool. Okay. Anyone else? Yes?
What your thoughts on charter schools are?
Okay. Are any of you alums of Teach for America? No? Most law schools have lots of alums from Teach for America, but okay, charter schools. All right, let me dive into a little bit of this, and then you can finish your sandwich, and that'll give you energy and food for more thinking, and you can challenge me some. Let me start with Arnie Duncan. I don't remember if it was in this piece that I wrote for you guys. I don't think so. Did I call Arnie Duncan out? Bad. I felt like I wrote something on Huffington Post, and I felt bad about it because it was kind of mean. Because I said realistically, Obama's choices were between the 4 failed urban superintendents. And I felt bad that I'd said that about Arnie, but it's true. In the sense that the 4 superintendents who were really being seriously considered by Obama, and it's interesting that it's often superintendents. You remember Rod Page, who went to Washington with George Bush? I'm sorry? I'm sorry, they're all CEOs. Good point, all 4 of them, and I appreciate the correction. But Rod Page went from Texas with George Bush. African-American guy, had been the CEO of the Houston Public Schools. And he came to Washington with the Texas Miracle. Do any of you remember this? Probably you weren't paying close enough attention, but I was paying attention. The Texas Miracle was that amazingly, Rod Page, when he was running the city school system, just doubled the test scores. I mean, it's just almost overnight. Now, anybody who knows anything about the way these tests work knows that they cannot be changed overnight unless you change the population taking them. So if you push certain people out, like we had a school in Chicago a decade ago, and everybody said, amazing. I think it was Healy School, incredible. What a principal. In 2 years, the test scores went, phew. Well, there were other things that happened besides the principal. Like, for example, the public housing kids were all moved out, and Asian kids, recent immigrants, all moved in. Now, I don't want to reinforce that stereotype, but nevertheless, I mean, you're testing different kids. And it's a different world, right? Well, that was the Texas Miracle. Why I say the 4 failed urban CEOs is because you have Michelle Rhee, who I spoke about in D.C., Joel Klein in New York, Paul Vallis of Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Orleans, and Arnie Duncan. And of those four, well, first a word on the four and why I say they're failed. There's not one of those four can point to actual accomplishments in their school systems in terms of the development of the kinds of goals even that they themselves have. That's why that Time magazine story is so revealing, because it doesn't even say test scores are up. It says she closed schools. And that's supposed to be a stand-in for test scores soon to follow. But it's just not true. And there's no evidence of it. So all four of these superintendents have in common that they have great public relations offices, that they have great people saying how great they are, that they don't know anything personally about the enterprise that they lead, just like every other business. Who runs Commonwealth Edison? Nobody who knows anything about the electric business. That's passé. It's got to be somebody who knows about finance and reworking the numbers and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's true of these four. Arnie is the most sensible choice of the four for two reasons. One is because, like President Obama, he's a pragmatist and he's a moderate, like President Obama. He's not a progressive or a radical like Linda Darling Hammond, who was the choice of every educator you might have talked to. Linda Darling Hammond was the dean of, she's an African-American woman, about 55 years old, dean at Harvard, now at Stanford, and really a brilliant, brilliant person. But Linda Darling Hammond, who headed the selection committee for Obama, has written scathingly about Teach for America and scathingly about charter schools. She didn't have one chance in a million. She would have been the Lonnie Guinier of the Obama administration. She would have attracted all the, crazies, and everybody already had her dead, and, she wouldn't have lasted. So, I think that's a shame, because actually she does know the enterprise. She knows schools from the inside. She would bring wisdom and balance, but it wasn't going to happen. So of the four, the most ideological is Michelle Rhee. The most pragmatic is Arnie Duncan. And his politics are in line with his boss's politics, which means they'll get things done, which is kind of what you want, right? I mean, you want somebody who's going to be moderately effective. Problem, challenge, well, Arnie Duncan has got this big pie of money, right? This big pot of money, I guess. And there was that wonderful headline in the New York Times last month. It says, Arnie Duncan, quote, spend it fast, keep the receipts. I thought that was pretty cool advice to educators. But this is part of the stimulus package, and he's got billions of dollars to spread around. Now, what's the likelihood that that's going to be spent? Well, it's in contention, and it's mixed. So a lot of it is going to go to test prep. That's a horrendous waste of money and a terrific mistake, in my view, because test prep doesn't do what it promises. It siphons public funds into private hands, and it doesn't actually accomplish what it claims to accomplish. So and maybe I should stop at some point and unpack why that's true and why the kind of testing we've gotten kind of obsessive compulsive about is in itself one of the great obstacles we have. Should I say a word about that? Just a quick word. I could come back to it. But just a quick word. As long as this kind of testing regime that posits how you do Q&A or multiple choice on a short paragraph and then multiple choice on a math problem, as long as that's held up, and it's been held up absolutely unanimously and ferociously for the last 8 years, if that's what it means, if that's what I'm going to get judged on as a teacher, what happens to my curriculum? I'm going to teach you how to answer questions on a paragraph and how to make a good guess on math. That's supposed to stand for intelligence. And the test makers will always say, but we don't intend that to happen. You may not intend it to happen in your dreams, but in reality, if that's what we're testing and that's what counts, we're not stupid. We will do that. But that's not the only way even to do assessment. There's lots of ways to do assessment. The National Test of Educational Progress, which was developed in the 60s and is still probably the truest gauge of how people are doing in education. When they first developed, they had all kinds of questions like this. This would be a contemporary example. You're a high school junior, and they would ask you a question like this. Write a paragraph in which you argue for the principle of gay people having the right to be married. And then they'd say, write a paragraph opposing the right of gay people to marry. That would be a contemporary example. They did it around other questions then. But that's really kind of an interesting thing. That asks the teacher to do something else, doesn't it? Or, since we're educating for democracy, what they did in the original NAPE tests was they did things like they would give a scenario. The scenario was you were at a public park, you were going to the swimming pool, a black kid was being denied entry into the swimming pool. What course of action should you take? Write a paragraph offering 2 possible courses of action. That was on the test. That asks you to teach something different than what we're being asked to teach right this minute, right? Or they might have a question like should the following people be allowed to speak on television? Someone who says that religion is a fraud and there is no God. 2, someone who promotes communism. 3, Jeremiah Wright and Bill Ayers. No, I mean, that wasn't on there. But I'm saying, you see what they did by asking certain other kinds of questions is they broadened the sense of what it means to be an educated person because, and we could spend a lot of time on this, but there are about 35 or 40 kind of qualities and skills that have to be taught in a public education. And we teach 2 of the narrowest if we go down this road wholeheartedly. Now, most teachers don't, and most teachers find ways to resist it. But so that's a short, long answer about Arne Duncan. I don't know what's before Congress right now in terms of legislation, but there are several things that ought to be done immediately. One is No Child Left Behind should be put out of business right away, and it's not that hard to do in this moment, and it should be done. And the reason is because it is a total and complete failure. And the conservative critics are in many ways the harshest critics of No Child Left Behind, because the liberal critics tend to want to hold on to the ideal that they bought into, which was we're not going to let the, what did Bush call it, the soft something of discrimination, what did he call it? The soft bigotry of low expectations. And that was the way in which No Child Left Behind was sold, but it hasn't lived up to it even a little. It's done just the opposite. And that, in some ways, was predictable. But there are a lot of things I think they should do right away. Get rid of No Child Left Behind. They should get the military out of the high schools completely. Because who knew? Who knew? Anyway, Chicago is the most militarized school system in the country. And if you challenge them and you say, why are you doing this? They say, and you say you're just using this as a recruitment tool, because there's no military at New Trier, and there's no military at Glenbard, and there's no military at Naperville South. In fact, they don't let much into Naperville South, but there's no military, and so why is there military in the black schools on the west side? Why? And they say, well, it's not, and you say, if you challenge them and say it's recruitment, they say it's not recruitment. We just think it's a good kind of alternative. And you say, what's the other alternative? Where's the other alternative? It's just military or nothing, right? And then you note that the Pentagon budget has a huge, huge budget for recruitment, and within that recruitment budget is JROTC. So don't think that it's not about recruitment. It's about recruitment. And the schools, the public schools, are a civilian, not a military enterprise. So then you say, well, we get all this money from the Department of Defense if we build a naval academy. There's something twisted about that. Why does it have to be that or nothing? And then the argument is, well, it teaches these kids discipline. And that's packed with a lot of stereotypes and a lot of views of who these kids are. But okay, there's nothing like a band to teach discipline, or or a soccer team, or I could name you 35 arts and sports things that teach profound discipline. My kids learn discipline through baseball and through painting, and that's a lot of discipline. So they should get rid of the military, in my view. There should be a massive campaign to rebuild the infrastructure of the educational infrastructure in this country. And why? Because it's unreasonable that we have a school that looks like Austin High School or DuSable High School within miles of a school that looks like New Trier or Naperville. That makes, I'll tell you, if you've not read, and if you're interested in this as a policy question, Jonathan Kozol introduced a new word into the American vocabulary, which is a new term, which is savage inequalities. And he wrote a book of that name, Savage Inequalities, which was a prize-winning book where he investigated schools in all over the country, but he looked at New Trier and DuSable. And he quotes kids at length. And if you think kids don't know what they're getting, they know exactly what they're getting. They see TV, they know what's out there, and they know what they're getting. And if you go to a school that not only is run down and dilapidated, but where there's no doors on the bathroom stalls, you have to ask for toilet paper, there's raw sewage in the corner, you get a message, and it doesn't take long for Chicago, which has close to a 50% dropout rate, which is one of the policies I wouldn't hold up if I were running for Secretary of Education, or one of the results, that is. So I would rebuild the educational infrastructure. I would do away with abstinence-only education, a proven failure, one that shames people and particularly shames GLBTQ people. And we all know that the highest suicide rate in high schools is gay kids, and that has to end. So, I could go on for hours because I think about this stuff. But those are a few of the big things that I think matter, and they would change things dramatically. I think what was brilliant about Chicago 20 years ago is that we had the Chicago school reform impulse, which was profoundly democratic, which brought parents and teachers into the mix around policy making. And I was a brand new assistant professor at the time, and I got involved in it. And my dean, the dean of the biggest college of education in the city, in the area, said to me, "Don't get involved in school reform. They're just giving the keys of the asylum to the lunatics." Now, if the dean of the college thinks that black parents in Chicago are the lunatics, and the superintendent at the time, Manford Bird, when he was criticized in the Tribune, responded by saying, "It's not my fault. If you put garbage into a system, garbage comes out," speaking incidentally of the children. Well, talk about the hard bigotry of low expectations. That's horrible. So I think that what we had going in Chicago for a while, and it didn't last, but the idea that we ought to trust in a democracy people to make the decisions that affect their lives and find structures where that can happen. Every suburban district has a community elected parent type school board. Why not us? Why are we different? So again and again, when I look at policy, I always ask myself this question: what do the wisest and most privileged parents want for their kids? And why can't we have it for all kids? If in Winnetka you go to any elementary school up there, I love Winnetka, so I'm not beating up on Winnetka at all. I love it. I love the schools. My brother says the great thing about Winnetka is it's socialism for the rich. Once you get there, everything's paid for. But getting there, holy crap, it takes you forever. I have a friend who taught English to my children when he was in the city. He had an autistic child. He borrowed and begged and stole and everything he could get so he could get a little tiny house in Winnetka where his autistic kid would be fully taken care of. Beautiful. But why for them and not for us? Why for some and not for others? That's federal policy too, and that can change. It's also state policy. Why the property tax? Why is that sensible for education? Why not a property tax for the military and let $1 trillion a year be spent on schools? Well, now you've got me started, sorry. Renaissance 2010, the biggest problem with it is what you said, that anything, and this is something that Duncan is mixed on, he's ambivalent about. In my view, we have to keep the public square open, the public space open, the space for public debate, the space for public discussion. And anything that closes or sells off the public space is, in my view, a mistake. So, for example, how many of you like the new parking meters? I want to just strangle them. What are they doing? And in fact, I'm getting a ticket as we speak. Why did we sell that? I mean, why? Or the most gruesome, of course, is the private military and the private prisons. What is a private, profit-driven prison system doing in a democracy? Don't we have a responsibility as a polity, as citizens, to, if we decide that someone must be incarcerated, isn't our responsibility to do it? It seems to me it is. And to sell it off and say, and then to see, you've seen this stuff, I'm sure, but to see these people saying, well, the beds, we don't have enough beds filled over here, we got to fill more beds. The hell are you talking about? We don't fill beds in a democracy of prisons, Anyway, so I think it's a huge and fatal mistake to sell off the public schools to private entrepreneurs. I think it's a fatal mistake, and it's one that we will pay for a long time. On the other hand, I think that private education and homeschooling, obviously, it's, to me at least, has a place, that people should be able to make decisions, for themselves and the ways they want to go. And if you want to have a religious education and so on, it seems to me that we ought to be open to that. But if we had outstanding, excellent, flexible, challenging, nurturing, wonderful schools of choice all over the city of Chicago, that's what people would choose. I'm confident that that's what people would choose. People run from it because it's not working for them. And it's understandable, because you have a responsibility to your own child. You don't just have a responsibility to humanity. You have some major responsibility for your own kids. So, and charter schools. Again, the theory of charter schools, I have so many friends who run charter schools, and I've been involved with them a lot, but the theory of charter schools is that they will spur the other schools to get better. So the question always to ask charter school proponents is, how? How will they do that? Will they siphon off the energy that could be built into innovating all schools? Why a charter? What is wrong with the schools? You have to charter some schools. That's one question. Second question is, who's the chartering agency? In Chicago, the chartering agency is the Chicago Public Schools. Well, if it's good enough for this charter school, why don't we just charter them all? And every school is a charter school. What is it we're trying to do? And the fact is that for many charter proponents, not all, my brother is kind of a major charter guy in Illinois, but for many charter people, it's an anti-union push. And again, here we are, in the metaphor land. Unions, bad. They must be bad. They must be protecting those lazy, incompetent teachers. But what was there before there were unions? And shouldn't teachers have a right to organize? And don't they actually do better in a unionized system? Winnetka's unionized. Nobody's beating up on their union. So what is it we're really talking about? And in some ways, these become slogans that stand in for other things rather than the things themselves. So let me ask you to ask a bunch of other questions. Are we out of time?
Yeah.
What? That's not right. I thought we had till 1.
Well, we have another class coming in, so we have to get
Classes
out.
are coming in.
They can wait. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. They can't wait.
It really is.
I'm sorry?
I'm not lying, it really is.
No, it really did get moved until 2:30, our 1 o'clock class. It's in here.
Okay.
It's in here?
Yeah, but it's supposed to be at 1, but it got moved to 2:30.
Well, let's take 5 more minutes, could we? And those of you who want to leave, don't worry.
They have 1 o'clock.
You got 1 o'clock classes, and judges are coming in to give guest lectures.
So, before
Shit
you all
like that.
leave, thank you so much for your time and attention, and thank you for good Lord, I can't speak, to Professor Ayers on behalf of the College of Law,
Thank
Journal
you.
for Social Justice, Center for Public Interest Law, Latino Law Students Association, and the National Lawyers Guild. Okay.
Okay, thank you.